Is it foolish to view the universe as more than simply the material from which it is made?
Thoughts aren't material, neither is a sense of purpose. Even information is more than just atoms.
Or is it foolish to insist that everything in the universe can be reduced to interactions among the basic elements of matter?
Believe it or not, debate over the nature of the universe isn't new. It's been going on in one form or another since at least 5 centuries before the birth of Christ, and probably longer than that. Once upon a time, there was a Persian king named Xerxes.
Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as the Jews called him, is described in the biblical book of Esther. He's the king who married Esther and had his scheming prime minister Haman hung, an event celebrated in the Jewish holiday called Purim.
The father of a lad named Democritus provided supplies to Xerxes' armies when they were at war and received a handsome reward. As a child of privilege, Democritus studied under a teacher named Leucippus, then spent his sizable inheritance traveling and studying all the wisdom then available.
Leucippus and Democritus are among the very first people we know of to come up with the idea that everything is made up of atoms. Their reasoning was that when something is split to a point where no more splitting is possible, that smallest part of the smallest part, the thing that can no longer be split, is called an atom.
Belief in atoms developed into a philosophy called atomism, which is important because it asserts that for all practical purposes, only atoms exist. If gods exist, they don't interact with the atoms, so they're irrelevant to material beings like humans. The atomistic ideas of Democritus are important to us because they fired the great debate in Western thinking between those who believe the gods are not important to the world of men and those who believe that the gods designed the world and continue to be involved in human lives.
Democritus had disciples, among whom was another Greek named Epicurus. Epicurus was a straight-A overachiever who wrote about atomism so brilliantly that people started calling the theory by a new name, Epicureanism.
Epicureanism is like atomism on steroids, and it caused a sensation in ancient Greece. People thought it denied the idea of an immortal soul, the order of the universe, and the existence of the gods.
It wasn't long before Epicurus was accused of atheism.
Epicurus vigorously denied the charge of atheism. He argued that in order to be holy and perfect, the gods had to remain in a state of perfect bliss, something they couldn't do if they had to interact with the clearly imperfect material world.
Epicurus wrote,
"Troubles and anxieties and feelings of anger and partiality do not accord with bliss, but always imply weakness and fear and dependence upon one's neighbors."
Weakness, fear, and dependence upon one's neighbors are clearly not godlike characteristics.
By making the gods so perfect that they could not interact with the material world, either now or at the time of its formation, Epicurus rendered them irrelevant to material beings.
In other words, Epicurus and modern materialists have something in common. They both look for truth only in the material world. They don't believe in ghosts, goblins, gods, and other superstitious things.
Atomism didn't rise in a vacuum. It may be seen as a response to the philosophy of Parmenides. One central claim of Parmenides was that it is impossible for something to come from nothing. From this he reasoned that change must merely be an illusion, and therefore reality is a single, unchanging whole.
The atomists said that wasn't true. Change is possible without creating something from nothing. The atoms themselves don't change, but they do rearrange themselves, and that movement achieves change without creating something from nothing.
Then came Aristotle, who pointed out that atoms don't move by themselves. Atoms ultimately require something to move them if they're going to arrange themselves in different ways to achieve real change.
So the atoms need a kind of push.
A push from something that Thomas Aquinas would later call a primus motor, or prime mover.
Aristotle realized that this prime mover had to be immaterial. If it was made of material, like the atoms, it would also move by bouncing off the atoms it moved, just as happens when one ball strikes another.
The ultimate source of the movement can't itself be moved by something else, or it wouldn't be the ultimate source of the movement. Therefore, this prime mover has to be immaterial, like the gods. In a brilliant intuitive leap, Aristotle realized this immaterial, unmoved mover was thought, which he called logos, or word.
In terms of our great debate between theists, who believe in God, and materialists, who believe that matter is all there is, the important thing to remember is that the views of Aristotle and the philosophers who followed him allowed for the active participation of gods in the lives of men. Their views are consistent with theism.
The views of Epicurus and the atomists rendered God or gods irrelevant. They were materialists.
But was it only a few ancient Greek philosophers who were materialists like Epicurus?
No, there were materialistic philosophers in India and probably other places, possibly even before Leucippus. For example, about 600 BC, the Brihaspati Sutra set out materialistic Chavaka philosophy, which advocated living without fear of judgment after death.
So there were actually multiple lines of materialistic thought in the ancient past.
Yes, but Chavaka philosophy ultimately died out in India. We will follow what happened after Epicurus in the West.
Aristotle's unmoved mover requirement held sway with many, but Epicurean philosophy was also popular.
Titus Lucretius Carus, a Roman better known simply as Lucretius, was an Epicurean poet who lived until around 55 BC. Lucretius was among the first to clearly write out a materialistic story of evolution, explaining how the universe came to exist while excluding involvement by any gods.
According to Lucretius, the universe is infinite and eternal. Everything in it is the consequence of random combinations and recombinations of atoms taking place across huge space and over a vast period of time.
The atoms did not intend to intelligently place themselves in orderly arrangement, nor did they negotiate the motions they would have, but many atoms struck each other in numerous ways, carried along by their own momentum from infinitely long ago to the present. Moving and meeting in numerous ways, all combinations were tried which could be tried, and it was from this process, over huge space and vast time, that these combining and recombining atoms eventually produced great things, including the earth, sea, and sky, and the generation of living creatures.
Lucretius argued that the atoms didn't need an unmoved mover because they were already moving. They had always been moving. It was their nature to be in motion, and they did not exist unless they were in motion.
The atoms kept rearranging themselves and creating change by bumping into each other. Eventually, they bumped into each other just the right way to create the earth, the sky, and us.
Lucretius advanced his ideas primarily using philosophical and theological arguments. One major theological argument he used pointed out that the world isn't perfect, and, according to him, gods would only make a perfect world, so they can't have made ours.
What is so imperfect about the world?
One major imperfection that many people see is all the inherent suffering. Lions appear designed to slaughter gazelles for food, and every living thing ultimately dies. The ancients observing the planets from Earth saw another imperfection in their strange erratic movements. What kind of god would design that? Lucretius argued,
The nature of the universe confirms it cannot have been created for us by divine power. It has so many faults.
In more recent times, Stephen Jay Gould made the same point this way.
Imperfection carries the day for evolution over divine creation.
And imperfection, particularly suffering and other evil things, is the very problem that Charles Darwin struggled with when he wrote his Origin of Species.
The problem of an imperfect universe does not logically mean the universe could not have been designed, but it is tough for those who believe the universe was created by a good God.
It has to have been on people's minds when Jesus lived and died, and when his disciples started writing down what they thought.
Remember that Aristotle used the word logos to describe the mover who gave the push to the atoms? Well, The Apostle John began his gospel using the same Greek word, logos, which is usually translated into English as word.
In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Logos.
So John comes in 100% on the side of design.
Yes, he does. The approach he takes, however, is different than Aristotle's. Instead of attempting to argue from first principles or some preconceived idea of what gods must be like, John makes an extremely empirical argument. He was there. He saw with his own eyes.
The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth.
John insists that the Creator became part of his creation.
Even though the material world isn't perfect, God still became part of it. John's disagreement with the atomists must have been problematic to philosophers of the time.
John's proposition was truly scandalous in some circles, but it must have been difficult to argue against his witness.
The Apostle Paul wasn't one of the disciples, so he couldn't really call himself an eyewitness.
Because of that, he used a different approach with those who did not believe in a creator God. He argued that the presence of design in nature is essentially self-evident.
For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse.
When Paul talked to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in Athens, he began his argument with an appeal to the creation, proposing the unknown God as the ultimate cause. His audience was familiar with the form of this argument and followed him until he proposed that God became flesh and entered the material world. He lost his audience there because this claim was beyond what Stoic and Epicurean ideas of the divine could accommodate.
Aside from Paul, the apostles weren't philosophers. Unlike Lucretius and Aristotle, they didn't rely on complex philosophical arguments, but on their own direct experience of the divinity, death, and resurrection of the actual creator God. It seems an eyewitness account would trump a philosophical argument.
And it did just that for a lot of people. Christianity swept the Roman Empire, but the eyewitnesses died off over time. And Christians had to once again rely on logic and philosophy as a common language they could use to reach the minds of unbelievers.
If you weren't a believer, you didn't believe the Bible. People who don't believe in the Bible don't care what the Bible says.
Exactly. In order to make your point, you have to start with the same reality that everyone experiences. One Christian who did a compelling job developing philosophical arguments was Thomas Aquinas.
Based on arguments developed by Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas wrote down 5 powerful reasons he believed God exists. These reasons were so compelling that for hundreds of years, almost everybody in the Western world accepted them as true.
First, Aquinas disagreed with Lucretius that atoms always moved because it was their nature to move. He agreed with Aristotle that there had to be an unmoved mover to move the atoms. Remember, Aquinas called the unmoved mover the primus motor, or prime mover.
By asserting that the universe and motion are eternal, Lucretius had already come up with a way to avoid the need for a prime mover, so Aquinas had to keep going if his ideas were to hold up. His second argument is based on something Aquinas called efficient causes.
The efficient cause argument is the same argument the Apostle Paul used in talking about the unknown God to the Epicureans and Stoics. Essentially, it states that nothing can be the cause of itself. It must have a creator. Therefore, nature can't be the cause of itself and requires a designer, God, to create it.
That also disagrees with Lucretius, who said that given enough space and time, atoms would combine in ways that resulted in the earth and sky.
Third, Aquinas pointed out that because there are a finite number of things, and things don't last forever, at some point in infinite time there must come a point where nothing exists.
This idea is important because since things require a cause and things do exist, the fact that things exist mean the cause of those things also exists. Thomas Aquinas called that necessary cause God.
For his fourth reason to believe God exists, Aquinas appealed to the great chain of being. Different beings are distributed along this chain, with plants below animals, snails below mice, mice below humans, and so on, all the way up to the angels and beyond. From the lowest to the highest, everything was arranged along the chain of being according to various scales of goodness, truth, and other such things.
Aquinas argued that because all gradations along the chain ultimately emanate from the ultimate state of being, that ultimate being, or God, must exist.
So the ultimate goodness, the ultimate truth, the ultimate being, God, must exist to account for the various grades of truth, goodness, and so on that we see.
Finally, for his fifth reason, Aquinas realized that most things, even the inanimate things, exist for an obvious purpose. Purpose is the product of intelligence. Each thing's purpose fits with the design of an intelligent being, and that intelligent designer is God.
Aquinas' ideas prevailed until David Hume in the 18th century.
Hume directly attacked Aquinas by challenging his design arguments. If he could persuade people that the universe did not require a designer, then he could pave the way to argue that the universe and its inhabitants are only material, making God, once again, irrelevant.
Like Aquinas, Hume laid out his view with 5 classic arguments that today serve as commonly expressed objections to design in nature. Some people think Hume's 5 arguments have definitively done away with not just the arguments of Aquinas, but all design arguments.
So before Hume, Aquinas had most Western people believing God was necessary, both philosophically and because of design we observe in the universe. And after Hume, intellectuals started swinging back to believing in a universe that was entirely material. A universe where God and other non-material elements don't exist, or, if they do, they exist outside of nature, outside of our ability to perceive them, and outside of any relevance to humans.
Hume's first argument observes that nature produces ordered things like crystals without an obvious intelligent agent to cause them. Because of this, it is illogical to claim that all ordered things or objects with apparent purpose imply an intelligent agent like God.
So, because crystals can form with no apparent help from God, a leaf can form with no apparent help from God, and the universe can form with no apparent help from God.
Yes. Hume's second and third arguments stem from the fact that we only have one universe to study.
His second argument claims it's a false analogy to say that because we can recognize designed versus undesigned phenomena within the universe, we can also recognize that the universe itself is designed.
Those who agree with Aristotle and Aquinas look at the universe and see evidence of design.
But those who agree with Epicurus and Hume think the universe is not designed, arguing that there's no real way of knowing whether or not this universe is designed because we don't know what a designed universe looks like.
Some people have hypothesized that there are actually multiple universes, and this explains why we live in one so ideally suited to life. We just happen to get the life-sustaining universe by chance.
If this multiverse hypothesis is true, couldn't we compare universes in the same way we compare dress designs in a clothing store?
The problem is that other universes are unobservable. The best that we can do is to create computer models of them. It's our inability to shop universes that gets at the core of Hume's third argument. Even if the universe does appear to be designed, this does not logically lead to theism. If the universe is one of a kind, you can't draw any conclusions concerning its cause. Here's how Hume said it.
Were an effect presented, which was entirely singular, and could not be comprehended under any known species, I do not see that we could form any conjecture or inference at all concerning its cause.
So even if our one-of-a-kind universe is designed, according to Hume, we have no way of knowing the cause of that design.
And that brings us to Hume's fourth argument. Even if the universe requires design, the mind that designed it must require at least as much design, and thus also requires a designer who must be designed, and so on.
Alternatively, if the designer, God, can be self-ordered, then why not the universe? If that is the case, then God becomes unnecessary to explain an ordered universe.
And that brings us to Hume's fifth argument. Frequently, apparent design for a purpose may be just as well explained by a filtering process rather than a teleological process, a process with a goal or purpose.
That's like Charles Darwin saying evolution works its way toward better creatures when natural selection filters out weaker creatures and allows stronger creatures to live.
The stronger creatures will look better designed because they are better adapted than other life forms to handle life in the niche they occupy.
Creatures living today look as though they were designed for a purpose, when in fact they survived simply because they muddled their way to a better match with their environment.
Like Hume, Darwin clearly opposed arguing from nature to an intelligent cause for life. Darwin agreed with Lucretius that the world is designed so badly that if God in fact designed the world, we must conclude that God isn't very nice. The physicist and philosopher Cornelius Hunter made this observation.
The whole point of Darwin's theory was to separate God from the world in order to explain its inefficiencies and quandaries. He couldn't then smuggle God back into the theory to explain complexity.
And yet the universe is both elegantly balanced to allow life to exist, and life itself is richly functional and complex. Understanding apparent evil and inefficiency in nature is not a challenge that trumps the challenge of understanding all that is perfect, beautiful, and elegantly functional in nature. Yes, there are apparent issues like death and suffering, but that in no way logically means nature is not designed.
Evil things like instruments of torture can be designed, so evil does not eliminate the possibility of design. At the same time, there are numerous things within the universe that are best explained within the context of design.
It may be true that we have only one universe to study, but we have many planets that we can compare with Earth. When the comparison is made between Earth and other planets, it seems to be remarkably well suited to the existence of life compared to anything else yet discovered. The Earth's position in the universe and within the Milky Way galaxy is necessary for life, as is its position relative to the Sun, which happens to be just the right kind of star.
The list of factors that make Earth hospitable to life, apparently designed for life, is truly remarkable. It is not just a complex combination of factors. Every planet has a complex combination of factors. It is that every necessary component of the complexity is just what is needed for life to thrive.
The mathematician and philosopher William Dembski has directly challenged Hume's claim that order produced by intelligent design can't be distinguished from order produced by nature acting alone.
Dembski points out that the difference between a rock and an arrowhead is similar to the difference between the other known planets and Earth. Arrowheads are both complex and specified.
The complexity suggests the arrowhead is improbable. The shape suits its specific function. An arrowhead can't be just any shape. It has to fit within the specifications of an arrowhead to perform its function. The presence of both complexity and specification in an object suggests it is designed whether or not we know who the designer was.
Even if we have never seen something before, we routinely infer design when we see what is obviously complexity and specification. For example, when we see different forms of writing, like Egyptian hieroglyphics, we infer design even when we can't read it and may never understand who wrote it or what it means.
The same logic should apply when we study nature. When we look at the universe and our planet, they are definitely complex and fit the specifications necessary for life. If we looked at life itself and saw things like DNA that spelled out gibberish, we would not infer an intelligence behind the DNA. But when we see complex and specific information encoded in DNA, it also makes sense to infer that DNA is a product of intelligent design.
Back when Hume was making his arguments and Darwin was applying them to biology, they really didn't have the understanding of living things that we have today.
That's right. Our modern understanding of biology has really changed everything. Michael Behe is a biochemist who has directly taken on Darwin's challenge that
if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down.
Behe and others have demonstrated that cells are full of irreducibly complex molecular machines that can't evolve directly one part at a time. These machines are essential to life and can't be formed by numerous successive slight modifications any more than a shovel can be converted into a digital camera by slight modifications, all of which make it more functional.
Modern molecular biology seems to pose a real problem for Darwinism. With all this new information, why do people stick with arguments that deny design in nature?
Remember back to the roots of the argument over the nature of the universe. On the one hand, there were those who believed that ultimately everything is just atoms. These were people like Democritus, Epicurus, and Lucretius. They held their beliefs for theological and philosophical reasons, not just because there was overwhelming evidence that drove them to their conclusions.
On the other side were those who believed that nature does not ultimately explain itself. The evidence points toward a supernatural cause for life, the universe, and nature itself. These people, like Aristotle, the Apostles, and Aquinas, believe there is plenty of evidence of a God who transcends nature, but also had theological and philosophical reasons for their beliefs.
And that is why the debate continues, irrespective of the evidence. Some dread the thought of death and fear judgment. Some desire eternal life and hope to escape the confines of life in our imperfect world. There are many motivations, and data only accounts for part of the debate.
Many changes have occurred over the millennia since philosophers debated in the agoras of Athens, and Democritus spent his fortune studying the wisdom of the world. Some questions that the ancients struggled with have been resolved, and yet debate continues over the nature of the universe. I guess it always will as long as people are motivated to argue for what they want rather than what is real.
That is true, and yet the recent resurgence of design arguments has been fueled by a rapid increase in knowledge about our universe and life. The more we know, the more designed everything looks. Christians are liberated by the gospel to believe in a loving Creator God. This frees believers to take at face value the historical record of God's action throughout history and the evidence of design in nature.